and thanks everybody for being here at very different times, I know for you. So the spirit of the Plato Roundtable is a discussion. So I'm just going to say some things kind of up front. I'll share my screen, run through some slides, all just sort of in the spirit of conversation and discussion about research in pre-college philosophy. So that's kind of the big idea, and I'll get started right away. Can I get a thumbs up from can you see that from the folks? Okay, thank you so much. Awesome, okay. So before I jump right into it, I want to signal, one, that there's kind of a resource in progress from Plato, the host of this roundtable, that's kind of made available by the research committee, which is a committee that I'm chairing. Lots of thoughtful people kind of working on assembling resources and kind of curate existing work in research and assessment efforts in pre-college philosophy. It's at that link there. This is very much the beginning. It's a work in progress, but it's a resource to keep your eye on. The other thing I want to say to kind of set the stage is to draw some loose distinctions. And I'm not so interested in dwelling on the details here, but I want to roughly distinguish kind of assessment, program assessment efforts from research. And you might think if there is a real difference here, research is, in the business of producing generalizable knowledge. It often, but not always perhaps, involves kind of IRB and human subjects research with kind of heightened scrutiny of oversight. Assessment tends to be confined to kind of one program or campus or group or event, and it's interested in kind of improving that program. But actually, assessment and research have a lot in common. They both involve, in some sense, data collection and analysis. And so, these are fuzzy boundaries, but I'm going to be thinking about research in the kind of stronger sense, insofar as we can distinguish it from something like assessment of pre-college philosophy programs. And then, of course, there are diverse methodological approaches. And in the spirit of discussion, I'd love to hear what everybody kind of the approach they've taken or that they favor. But for example, you might take more quantitative approaches to research or more qualitative ones. And there are many more dimensions along which you can have kind of methodological diversity. I don't want to take a stand necessarily on that. And then finally, I just want to signal that this kind of work, I think, especially rewards, in fact, requires interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm a credentialed philosopher, and while I do know a thing or two, perhaps, about social science research, I am by no means equipped to do that kind of work in the way that I think, the seriousness that it requires. And so all the more reason to engage in various kinds of interdisciplinary collaboration. Okay, so that's really just upfront. What's kind of motivating this interest? Well, think of it this way. We have decades and decades of what I call anecdata, anecdotal evidence, testimonies, written, verbal, interviews, you name it, from students, teachers, schools, principals, whose curricula, whose time in school, whose experience as a student or as a learner has been transformed by philosophy. I'm sure you all have piles and piles of those stories of your own. We have our own here at UNC through the Ethics Bowl program, through our pre-college philosophy outreach programming, and our programming across the lifespan. Anecdata is extremely valuable, but it's just the beginning. It's not enough. It kind of motivates inquiry of the kind that I think we're talking about when we talk about research. It doesn't close it in any particular way. There is research, though, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'll just say there's quite a bit of interesting research just in the past few decades that suggests that pre-college philosophy can have positive impacts on cognitive, social, and emotional development, on student well-being. You've got really kind of persuasive qualitative reports out of major studies, especially in the UK, for example. There have been large effectiveness trials of philosophy for children. Interestingly, while there's quite a bit of positive evidence that comes out of that, a lot of that is retrospective reports, like teachers saying, this is this is the effect it seemed to me to have on my students, or students saying, this is the effect it seemed to have on me. When you look at more, let's say, rigorous longitudinal assessments or different kinds of assessments, there is some evidence that pre-college philosophy can improve cognitive ability among students or reading and math achievement. But there's actually some findings in some of those big UK studies that found kind of no effect. And so there's like a mixed bag, perhaps. It's a young research program. There's more research needed. There's some early work being done at UNC on intellectual humility that I'll talk about briefly. And there's some other Plato-affiliated folks I know are working on similar kinds of projects. All to say, this is very young. We have lots of anecdata and some pretty interesting early existing research. But we ought to do more, and we need to play the long game here. I think we need to be really patient. We need more data collected systematically over a long period of time. And we need to be open-minded about what the data show us, not looking just for what we want to be true, but actually kind of taking a clue from the data and learning from it and maybe adapting our practices. And finally, we need to be collaborating in this work. So far as possible, we need to be collaborating in data collection and analysis, using networks like that at the Parr Center for Ethics at PLATO to kind of come together and be more effective in the way that we do this and maybe more systematic. So here's a quick example of what we're doing at UNC. I'll just run through it kind of quickly, and I offer it as an example, just an invitation to think through how we could do this work and how we could maybe do it together and more systematically. So here's my version of the ANIC data that we were faced with the National High School Ethics Bowl program, headquartered at the Parr Center for Ethics. That is this kind of not so systematic, but nonetheless clear signal we were getting from students, from teachers, from coaches that this program has a big impact on their lives, on their schools. Lots of kind of testimonial evidence, end of year surveys. Eventually we did survey more systematically and found lots of students, for example, at nationals, 100% said that they thought ethics will encourage critical thinking. Now, this is a nice little moment of pausing. If anybody tells you something's 100% effective, that's the moment when you ask, okay, how could it be true? Is it really true? That's that kind of moment of humility I think you need to pause about. But nonetheless, this is a clear signal that something's going on. So what did we do? We formed some hypotheses. We thought about some of the outcomes we thought might be uniquely associated with Ethics Bowl and the pre-college philosophy programming that we do here at UNC, for example. And what are some of those things on the list? Here's a non-exhaustive one: intellectual humility, curiosity, intellectual autonomy, a sense of belonging. I've given you kind of ways of thinking about each of these outcomes underneath each, but there could be more. I'd love to hear from you all what you think some of the outcomes are. Those are kind of hypotheses that we formed. And then we tried to be a little more systematic. So one year, we surveyed students at the beginning of the Ethics Bowl season and at the very end. There were problems with kind of the attrition. So we had almost 600 people complete survey one, but half of that fill survey number two. Nonetheless, if you kind of look at this incomplete data, it's really interesting. Look at point number one that I've signaled there. Evidence of a selection effect. Forget the second survey, just look at the first one. Look at fall 2022 of intellectual humility. There's clear evidence that the Ethics Bowl students were starting at a kind of higher baseline. That's evidence of selection effect, which, if you're thinking in terms of research, kind of colors your ability to say something about the treatment effect, or at least makes it a little bit more complicated. I won't talk about the second one there. I just wanted to point out this kind of hypothesis formation led to an attempt in the 2022-2023 academic year to collect data. And then it led to this academic year. We thankfully secured funding from the Templeton Foundation to do two studies a bit more systematically. Study number one is about the Ethics Bowl, the National High School Ethics Bowl across the country. I won't talk about that study. I'm happy to discuss it, as we go on, but I won't talk about it right now. I just want to highlight that second study, which involved looking at pre-college philosophy, specifically in the form of Ethics Bowl style programming, students thinking through ethical dilemmas together, being collaborative and charitable as they deliberate in the classroom. That's what the so-called ethical conversations workshops are. So we're studying these in schools, and I'd be happy to say more about the study design, blah, blah, blah. But the important thing is it's a proper experiment. We've randomized when students get a workshop, when they complete the control survey, when they, which workshop do they get? Is it about this case or that case? We've checked all the kind of experimental boxes so that this is kind of methodologically at a level that we've aspired to for some time. And we're in the early stages of data analysis. We've already kind of hit our sample size, even though the project has another year to go. And I'm grateful with us today is one of my research collaborators and friends on this project, Dash. So maybe we can talk about this in a little more detail. But here's the way I'm going to end. I'm just going to show you this chart, and then I want to get to the questions that I kind of was hoping would orient our time together. If you just look at the middle schoolers, we did these workshops in middle school and high school. Bracket the high schoolers. Just look at the middle schoolers. You'll find that we actually saw a kind of positive effect on intellectual autonomy, significant, so statistically significant and positive in the right direction that we wanted, intellectual autonomy, curiosity, and intellectual humility. That's indicated at the bottom right by specific IH. That's a little jargony way. That's just our intellectual humility measure. I won't say anything about the other two for now. I just want to point out that with a very kind of large sample, this was workshops offered to every 7th grader, for example, at a Chapel Hill middle school. We saw positive effects. Again, we need more time. There's actually a part of this study that involves them writing essays, and we need to analyze those qualitatively. There's a lot more to be done here, but I just want to signal, this work is being done. We're very excited about it. We're very excited about kind of learning from what other people are doing. And in the spirit of that kind of ongoing conversation, these are the kinds of questions I thought could structure our discussion. So in what ways are you doing this work in your own schools or organizational contexts? What outcomes are you looking at? Maybe they're like the ones we're looking at, certain intellectual traits or virtues. Maybe they're not. What methods are you using? What methods are appropriate for measuring those outcomes? And what kinds of study designs and incentives, in your opinion, would enable schools, teachers, and students to have more buy-in and really to kind of participate in ongoing research in a way that'll let us play that long game that I alluded to earlier? So that's it for kind of conversational setup. Happy to say more about anything that came up over the course of that quick, brisk run through the slides.